In the echoes of history, there was a force the world could not contain. Not an empire born from marble cities, not a power forged in ancient halls, but a storm, rising from the open steppe, where the land stretched without end, and the sky felt closer than the earth itself. They came, not slowly, not cautiously, but like thunder across the horizon, and before the world could understand them, they had already changed it. Chapter 1. The land that created them. Before there was an empire, there was only the steppe, a vast, endless ocean of grass stretching across Central Asia, where the horizon never seemed to end and survival was never guaranteed. This was not a land that nurtured comfort. It demanded strength. The winters were merciless, freezing winds cutting across the plains without shelter. Summers brought heat and drought, where water became more valuable than gold. There were no walls to protect you, no cities to hide within, only the open land, and whatever you could carry with you. And so, the people who lived here adapted. They became riders before they became warriors. From a young age, children learned to mount a horse almost before they could walk. Horses were not just transportation. They were life itself. They provided movement, food, and survival. But more than that, they gave freedom. The tribes of the steppe did not think in terms of borders or fixed lands. They moved with the seasons, following water, following grass, following opportunity. And in this constant motion, something remarkable formed. A way of life built not on permanence, but on adaptability. Conflicts between tribes were common. Raids, alliances, betrayals. They shaped the rhythm of life. No tribe could afford weakness, because weakness meant extinction. And yet, despite this harshness, there was also a connection. Trade routes passed through the steppe, linking distant civilizations. Goods, stories, and technologies moved across this land, carried by those who understood how to survive it. But the steppe was never truly controlled. Empires to the south and west feared it. Armies that marched into it often found themselves lost, exhausted, and defeated, not always by warriors, but by the land itself. Because the steppe did not fight like a kingdom. It absorbed, it stretched, it waited. And within this unpredictable world, a new kind of power was quietly forming. Not in stone cities, not behind fortified walls, but in movement, in speed, in unity. The kind of power that could appear without warning and disappear just as quickly. The kind of power the world had never seen before. Chapter 2. The Man Who Became the Storm. Every storm has a beginning. For the Mongols, it began with a boy named Temujin. He was not born into power. His early life was marked by loss, betrayal, and hardship. His father, a tribal leader, was poisoned when Temujin was still young, leaving his family abandoned by their own people. On the steppe, abandonment was a death sentence. Without protection, without allies, survival became a daily struggle. Temujin and his family scavenged for food, hunted small animals, and endured conditions that would have broken most. But something in him did not break. It hardened. Temujin learned early that loyalty was fragile, and that power had to be earned, not inherited. As he grew, he began to gather followers, not through fear, but through trust. He offered something rare in the steppe: merit over lineage. Men followed him not because of his name, but because of his vision. He reorganized tribes that had once been enemies. He broke traditional hierarchies, placing capable warriors in positions of command, regardless of their origin. This was revolutionary and dangerous, because it threatened the old order. Conflicts came quickly. Rival leaders saw him not just as a challenger, but as a disruptor of everything they had built. But Temujin fought differently. He was not bound by tradition. He adapted. He learned. He turned defeat into strategy, and with each victory, his influence grew. What began as a small group of followers became an army. What began as survival became ambition. Then, in a moment that would echo across history, Temujin was given a new name, a name that would come to define an era. Genghis Khan, universal ruler. But this title was not just symbolic. It marked the transformation of a fragmented people into a unified force. For the first time, the tribes of the Mongolian steppe were no longer divided. They were one. And with that unity came momentum. The storm was no longer forming. It had begun. Chapter 3. The War That Moved Like the Wind. The world had seen armies before. Disciplined legions, armored knights, walls built to keep enemies out, and battles fought face to face. But the Mongols did not fight like any army the world understood. They moved like the wind, fast, unpredictable, relentless. Each warrior carried multiple horses, switching between them to maintain speed across vast distances. Where other armies slowed, the Mongols accelerated. Where others needed supply lines, the Mongols carried survival with them. They did not wait for battle. They created it. A Mongol army could appear on the horizon without warning. Thousands of riders emerging from dust and distance, and before their enemies could organize, the attack had already begun. But their greatest strength was not just speed, it was strategy. They studied their enemies, learned their weaknesses, adapted their tactics, and when necessary, they deceived. Feigning retreat became one of their most devastating tools. Mongol riders would turn and flee, luring their enemies into pursuit, stretching their lines, breaking their formation. And then they would turn back. What followed was not a battle. It was a collapse. Arrows would rain from all directions. Communication would fail. Panic would spread. And in that moment of confusion, the Mongols would strike with precision. Victory was not just about strength. It was about control. They controlled the battlefield before the first blow was even struck. And as news of their victories spread, something else began to grow. Fear. Cities whispered of them before they ever arrived. Stories traveled faster than armies. Stories of speed, of destruction, of an enemy that could not be stopped. Some cities resisted. Many did not. Because the Mongols understood something few others did. War was not only fought with weapons, it was fought in the mind, and once fear took hold, resistance became fragile. Across Asia, across deserts, mountains, and plains, the storm advanced, not slowly, not cautiously, but with a force that seemed almost inevitable. And with every victory, the world began to change. Chapter 4. The Empire That Connected the World. And then something unexpected happened. The storm did not only destroy, it connected. As the Mongol Empire expanded, it became the largest contiguous land empire the world had ever seen, stretching from the edges of China to the borders of Europe. But unlike many empires before it, its power was not defined only by conquest. It was defined by connection. Under Mongol rule, vast territories that had once been divided by conflict were suddenly linked. Trade routes became safer. Travel became faster. Communication became more reliable. For the first time in history, a person could journey across continents under a single political system. This period became known as the Pax Mongolica, Mongol peace. Caravans moved more freely along the Silk Road. Goods flowed in greater quantities. Silk, spices, metals, and ideas crossed distances that had once been nearly impossible. But it was not just trade that traveled. Knowledge moved with it. Technologies, inventions, and beliefs passed from one culture to another. Paper, printing techniques, medical knowledge, all spread along these routes. Even distant civilizations began to understand one another in new ways. And at the heart of this transformation was a system unlike anything before. The Yam, a vast network of relay stations spread across the empire, allowing messengers to travel incredible distances with speed and efficiency. Fresh horses, supplies, and shelter were always waiting. Information, once slow and fragile, became fast and reliable. And with information came control. The Mongols ruled not just through force, but through organization. They allowed religious freedom, encouraged trade, integrated different cultures into their system. For many, life under Mongol rule was not just safer, it was more connected than ever before. But beneath this unity, there was tension, because an empire built on expansion cannot expand forever. And when the movement slows, the question is no longer how it grows, but how it holds together. Chapter 5. When the storm fell silent. No storm lasts forever. Even the greatest forces, those that reshape continents and redefine power, must one day slow and fade. For the Mongol Empire, that moment did not come all at once. It came quietly, almost imperceptibly. After the death of Genghis Khan, the empire continued to expand under his successors. Cities fell, territories stretched even further. The storm still moved, but something had changed. It was no longer one force, it was many. The vast empire was divided among his descendants, forming separate khanates, each powerful, each ambitious, and each increasingly independent. At first, they remained connected by legacy, by shared identity, by the memory of the man who had united them. But memory is not the same as unity. Distances that once empowered the Mongols now began to weaken them. Communication slowed, interests diverged, rivalries grew. The system that had once connected the world began to fragment. And as the empire fractured, so did its control. Trade routes that had flourished under Mongol protection became uncertain again. The safety of the Silk Road faded. Caravans grew cautious. Movement slowed. In some regions, local powers began to rise once more, reclaiming independence, reshaping borders, rewriting authority. And beyond the empire, something else was changing. New routes were being explored. New ways of connection were emerging. The world that the Mongols had helped unite was beginning to move beyond them. But perhaps the greatest shift was not political. It was human. Generations had grown up under Mongol rule. They had adapted to stability, to connection, to a system that reached across continents. And as that system weakened, uncertainty returned. Not as a sudden collapse, but as a gradual silence. The relay stations grew quieter, the roads less traveled, the empire less present, until one day, the storm that had once thundered across the world was gone. Not defeated, not destroyed, but dissolved, returning to the land from which it had risen. The steppe remained. The wind still moved across it, but the force that had once carried it beyond the horizon had passed into history. In the echoes of history, the Mongols were never truly defeated. They were only scattered, piece by piece, until the unity that once defined them quietly disappeared. And in their place stood a world more connected than ever before, not by conquest, but by the paths they had opened. Thank you for listening to Echoes of History. If you want to explore more stories where unseen forces shape the world we know, subscribe and listen closely, because history is still speaking.